So at this point, we're going to get into some of the details. We're going to focus on element 1. So this is the planning part of the systemic safety process. And element 1 is composed of 4 steps. We're going to establish our focus. So this is very similar to the hotspot approach. What portion of our network do we want to focus on? What crash types do we want to screen for? Eventually, in step 2, we're actually conducting the network screening, identifying locations that we'd like to focus on. The remainder of the steps are very similar to the hotspot approach, where we select countermeasures, we prioritize those projects, and eventually we implement them. So countermeasure selection is where kind of crash modification factors come into play. If you've heard of that term before, we'll define that a little bit later. Benefit cost analysis comes into play with the project prioritization. But it's really these first 2 steps that differentiate the systemic approach from the hotspot approach. So how do we identify our focus crash types? How do we identify the facilities we want to focus on? And what are the risk factors, and how do we really assess what risk factors are appropriate based on the crash type and the facility type? So those are going to be the first 3 steps, or the first 3 tasks within step 1. So we'll go through step 1 and then 3 subtasks before we move on to here. And we have an exercise or an activity built in as well. So 3 steps. We need to figure out what crashes we want to focus on. For those crashes, where are they occurring? So what are our focus facility types? And then 3, what are the risk factors that relate to those crashes on those facilities? So what do we mean by focus crash type? It's pretty simple. It's basically the crashes that present the greatest opportunity for improvement. And from a systemic approach, this isn't real detailed. It's basically looking where you have the most, or what crash types represent the most severe crashes. So many of you will have easy access to this through your state's strategic highway safety plan. That's at the state level. If you're looking at the county level, you may have to do a little bit more analysis because your local trends can differ from the statewide trends. So we'll show some examples of that. But basically, you're looking for the crash types that have the most potential to reduce fatals and severe injuries. So this may be roadway departure crashes, it may be intersection, pedestrian, speeding, alcohol. These are different focus crash types that you might want to look at. So if you have ready access to the data, you could certainly conduct a system-wide analysis using that data. A quicker approach is to just pull open your state's strategic highway safety plan. Those are all available online for all 50 states. And look to the emphasis areas. So those emphasis areas are identified based on the crash types that have the most fatal and serious injury crashes. Several states also have these safety implementation plans. So maybe they have a focus on intersection crashes. If your state has an intersection safety implementation plan, you can bet that intersections rose to the top of their SHSP list, and it may also be the same for your county or your jurisdiction. But it is important, if you're working for a local agency or within a region of the state, that you take a look at that data just to see if the trends are similar or maybe you have a slightly different focus. And here's just an example of that. So this is showing the fatal and severe injury crashes from 2007 to 2011 for some state. Based on their statewide data, they had over 114,000 miles. And this is how some of the percentages break down. So if we were only looking at statewide data, we would say intersections here is the priority. That represents the largest percentage. If we broke that down by jurisdiction or road ownership, the state mileage, the county mileage, and the others, the city, town, and village, we see how the mileages shake out there, but the percentages change slightly. So for example, the state and county roads, the highest percentage are the roadway departure crashes. And then going back to the cities, towns, and villages, the intersections represent the greatest potential for improvement. So if we were looking at implementing a systemic approach on state or county roads, our focus crash type may be roadway departures. If we were implementing a citywide systemic approach, our focus crash type may be intersections. So that's as detailed as it gets, really. It's basically just taking a look at your data and figuring out what you want to focus on based on what represents the greatest potential. So we've already talked about the first bullet there, but the second bullet is important as well. So we don't always need to focus on engineering improvements. We may see that alcohol, speed, seatbelt use is a contributing factor or rises very high on the list, and those can be addressed through some systemic improvements as well, or at least we could partner with the law enforcement or education to help improve those. So once we've identified a focus crash type, we need to figure out where those crashes are occurring. So if you're looking at roadway departure, I'll start with intersections. If we're looking at intersection crashes, are those occurring at rural locations or urban locations? Are they at signalized intersections, stop-controlled intersections? Are they at 3-leg, 4-leg, so on and so forth? So we're trying to narrow down our focus so we're not biting off more than we can chew. We're starting with our entire network, and we're trying to pare that down to a manageable list of sites. So with roadway departure, we may want to think, again, are they rural or urban? A lot of times that's a rural issue, but are they on tangents or curves? Are they occurring during the day or the night? Wet weather versus dry weather. So we're looking into a little bit more detail here to figure out where these crashes are occurring. And here's just a few examples of what we might narrow the focus facility type down to. With the roadway departure, again, they may be on the interstate, they may be on your collectors and arterials, or they may be on your local roads. If they're on some of your higher class roadways, are they 2-lane or 4-lane? Are those on divided or undivided roads? So you can kind of get a flavor for the types of facilities we're looking for. To get down to the focus facility type, you could kind of run your data through a number of different pivot tables or create some data summaries to figure this out. Crash trees are a very useful tool, and FHWA has a crash tree maker in development. There's a prototype available. There's a couple of bugs to work out, but it is functioning, and it can help you to develop these if you load your data in the background. So this is just an example. Basically, we've selected our focus crash type, roadway departure crashes. We've taken 5 years of those crashes, and we've started to break them down. So this is for our entire state system. We had 4,400 crashes, and the first split is a pretty easy one, just rural or urban. So the majority of those crashes are occurring in rural areas. And then if we kind of look at those rural crashes a little closer, are those occurring on divided or undivided roads? The majority are on undivided. So with the crash tree, we're just following the percentages down. And when we look at number of lanes, the majority are occurring on 2-lane roads. And if we pull in the speed limit data, again, the large proportion here are on 55 mile an hour or greater roadways. So our focus facility type may be rural, 2-lane, undivided roads with a posted speed of 55 miles an hour or greater. So that really helps to narrow our focus for roadway departure crashes. And then we can start to think about what are the risk factors on these types of roads. Here's just a list of factors that you could use to create your crash trees. We'll have some examples of this a little later, but you may want to start splitting your tree by state and local. So if you haven't decided yet whether you're focusing on state or local, that's a pretty good top split. What I don't start with is a variable that has maybe 5 or 6 categories, because then your tree's getting really wide really fast. So try to break it on these binary variables, whether it's state or local, rural or urban, intersection or non-intersection related. So that kind of keeps things manageable for a little while, and then you can start expanding things out as you get to the bottom of the tree. Some of the secondary variables you may want to use, if this information is available, you can start to look at whether the crashes are occurring on tangents or curves, high-speed or low-speed roads, and so on. Many of those could become risk factors as well. So there's a kind of a fine line or a gray area as to what should be included in the crash tree versus what you might want to look at as a risk factor later on. A lot of this information, or all of this information, should be pretty much available from the crash data. So if you can get your hands on the crash data, as long as the officers are coding this information appropriately, that should be readily available. Some of this information is going to require additional information, or additional data to be tied in, like your roadway data. So you're not going to know the lane width, the shoulder width from the crash report. You'd need to tie in some additional information there. So really the purpose of crash trees is to help us narrow our focus, and by narrowing the crash types, we can focus our countermeasures. So if we were developing a crash tree for all fatal and serious injury crashes, and we say that these crashes are most prevalent on rural two-lane roads, that's not really helping us narrow our countermeasures, because those still could be at intersections or they could be run off the road. So by narrowing the crash type early on, that's going to help us get to a targeted list of countermeasures at the end. And by narrowing the facility type, that's really going to help us identify potential locations later on. It doesn't do us a lot of good to get to a crash type and a facility type where we're still looking at 50% of our network, because that's not helping to narrow the focus. So we want to keep narrowing that facility type down as much as we can. It can be useful to compare both total crashes and severe crashes. So the focus is generally on fatal and serious injury crashes. Those are the focus of the Highway Safety Improvement Program. And really, if we can address the fatal and serious injury crashes, we can live with some additional property damage only. So we generally don't focus on total crashes, but it is useful to compare those just to see if there's any differences. And when we start out with the analysis, before we start breaking the data down in our crash tree, it generally helps to have at least 100 crashes in your data set. So if you were only looking at a single year of data and you didn't have that sample size to work with, certainly you could expand to more years, and usually it helps to start with 3 to 5 years of data. For lower volume roads and smaller counties, I've seen 10 years of data used. So I wouldn't go too much beyond 10 years maybe, but certainly the 3 to 5 to 10 years would be reasonable. Another opportunity to enhance your sample size is to team up with nearby jurisdictions. So maybe adjacent counties pool their data, and maybe there's an LTAP or somebody that can help them analyze that data, but it can add some efficiencies, but it helps to expand your sample size as long as those counties have similar characteristics. So I wouldn't necessarily combine a highly populated urban county with a very rural county, but you can generally see some divides within every state. There's different regions that have commonalities, and you could pool that data together. Before we get into the risk factors, any questions on identifying focus crash types and facility types?
One thing that we see in rural Illinois, whether it's a risk type or if it's a roadway function, is fixed objects that are in the recovery area.
Yep.
Are we looking at those in a risk, or are we somehow taking those into account? Because those obviously are something that make the severity of the crash rise pretty quickly.
Absolutely. Those will definitely be included as a potential risk factor, as the fixed objects near the roadway, and we could look at either the density of fixed objects along the road, or start to characterize the clear zone as a level 1, 2, or 3, or good, bad, or ugly, whatever the case may be. But yes, we'll get into those with the risk factors for sure. Any other questions or comments? All right, so the risk factors are those characteristics that are associated with the focus crash type on the focus facility type. So we've maybe honed in on roadway departures. We've focused on roadway departures now on rural two-lane undivided roads. So what are the characteristics on rural two-lane undivided roads that are contributing to roadway departure crashes? And that's what we're trying to get at with these risk factors. So we generally see things like traffic volume, the roadway alignment, the intersection characteristics, and so on. This is a multi-step process with risk factors. The first thing we want to do is come up with a list of potential risk factors. This is just brainstorming. That doesn't mean these are all going to shake out as risk factors or actual risk factors. It doesn't mean that we're going to use them all as risk factors, but we start to think about what could be a risk factor, and then we collect and analyze some data to figure out which ones are actually risk factors for our crashes. So without looking at your packets, if you haven't already, what are some potential roadway features that can increase the risk of a crash? Curves? What was that one?
Limited shoulder,
Limited shoulder,
narrow.
narrow shoulder, all right? Any others? So we're the location? Ah, yeah, the land use. So what are the surrounding characteristics? Is it densely populated? Is it a commercial use? Any others? Vertical alignment. I'm getting better with the hand gestures. Just keep them PG. All right. So yeah, when we're thinking about the roadway characteristics, the cross section related to the lanes, the shoulder, the median width and type. When we get into the curvature, we could have vertical and horizontal curvature, but you may have various subsets of horizontal curvature as risk factors. So is the curve super elevated? Is it delineated? If not, that may be a risk factor. Is there a visual trap? Is anyone not familiar with the term visual trap? It's okay if you're not. Basically, it's when you have a curve, but visually it looks like the road continues to go straight, whether it's the tree line or utility poles. And maybe there was an old alignment that went that way, and for some reason the road was realigned to go a different direction. But it gives the driver the perception that the road continues straight when really it curves one way or the other. And that's a visual trap and can be identified as a risk factor in the analysis. The question from earlier, are fixed objects a risk factor? And they are. So we consider the roadside features, the clear zone, how wide is it, how far is it to the objects, what types of objects are there, are they large trees, are they small shrubs, and what does the side slope look like, steep embankment versus a gentle slope. You could also include some other features as either risk or protective features, and you'll see the difference when you look through the data. So the presence of rumble strips may reduce crashes, and that's good to know because you could say, well, that's a protective factor, and we want to install more of those, but also we want to look for sites without them. Same thing with lighting and parking. How about intersections? If we're looking for intersection risk factors, what would we think to look for?
Approach angles, visibilities.
Good. All right, the skew, the sight distance and visibility. Fantastic. The presence or absence of turn lanes, and there's a whole list here. So these lists you can start with, and then if you have data available for them, you could take a look at that and analyze it. If not, you may have an opportunity to collect some information and analyze that on a limited or select basis. So it's not necessary to collect data for all of the risk factors necessarily, but you want to look for those that may be highest priority. Pedestrian features, I'll just pull those up. The type of intersection control, the presence of a crosswalk, those are all features that can either enhance or reduce the safety, potential safety of pedestrians. And really the crossing distance, how many lanes do they have to cross? What is their exposure, both in terms of the width of the road, the number of vehicles, and the speed of those vehicles are all risk factors for pedestrians. Traffic volume and speed weren't listed on the previous slides because they're really cross-cutting. As you increase traffic volume, you increase risk. As you increase speed, you increase risk. The graphic here just depicts the risk for pedestrians being struck at different speeds, where at 20 miles per hour, 9 out of 10 times, the pedestrian is going to survive that crash. Where at 40 miles per hour, 9 out of 10 times, the pedestrian is going to die. So risk is very much related to speed. And here's some other factors that you could consider as well. Land use came up earlier, so whether the adjacent land use is a school, you'll have younger pedestrians, younger drivers, all kinds of potential issues near schools, and the others are shown there as well. So we've come up with our initial list of risk factors. Now we need to figure out which ones of these are actually increasing the risk of our focus crash type on our focus facility type. So we could look to the published literature, and if we don't have the data available, we very well may want to do that. If you have information, we can start to develop some descriptive statistics. and the next several slides have those. But going back to the medical example, doctors aren't conducting their own studies necessarily. They're not collecting data from each one of you and trying to figure out what might be a risk factor and analyzing their data. They're looking to the published literature and saying, well, based on this very well defined and conducted study, we know that smoking increases the risk of heart disease. So then they use that and they ask you, are you a smoker? Yes, okay, you have an elevated risk. They don't necessarily need to conduct their own analysis for that. So by all means, if you can find a well-done research study, you can use that to help support your analysis. So the next several slides are just examples. I understand not everyone has the data to create these. That's the real trick in this, is maybe finding a partner that can help you obtain this data. Maybe work with the state to see if there's some data collection opportunities. Work with local universities, the LTAP, and others to see what you can do here. But these are all examples that you can take back, and maybe you can mimic. Maybe you can do some and not others, and that's fine. But do as much as you can do with what you have. So if you had super detailed information on all of your curves, and you knew the curve radius, the blue line here, the dots, represent the percent of your system, or the percentage of your curves that have that specific curve radius. So approximately 6% of the curves have a curve radius between 500 and 600 feet. Another 6% are between 600 and 700 feet, and so on. So this represents the percentage of the curves across your system. The red bars are your severe crashes. The green bars on the right-hand side, for those who are red-green colorblind, we should probably change the colors of this. The green bars here on the right are the percent of your severe lane departure. So let's say those are our focus crash type. If for our curves with 500 to 600 feet, they represent 6% of the system, but over 8% of our lane departure crashes are occurring at those types of locations. So those crashes are overrepresented because the percent of crashes is higher than the percentage of curves with that particular characteristic. So what we're looking for in these types of charts is anywhere the percent of crashes is greater than the percentage of the curves. And in this case, we would say that between 500 feet and 1,000 feet, those are our curves that are indicating an increased risk of these roadway departure or lane departure crashes. So as Brian mentioned earlier,
What were the numbers you mentioned, Brian?
500 to 1,500.
Okay.
Which was kind of interesting because I'd never seen this chart before. Yeah, now you notice it goes up beyond the 1,600. Well, 1,600 is a pretty flat curve.
so you have lots of those locations. So the blue part represents the percentage of locations. So you have lots of those locations, and that's why you have probably a larger number of crashes out there, but they're not overrepresented. It does go up because you have more sites. You just don't have a lot of crashes occurring at those sites relative to the percentage of sites. So,
This is just an example, not research or.
yep.
This is an example.
Just an example, some,
But Minnesota was research. Minnesota was bringing the
on their actual
statistics
state,
together.
yeah.
And again, Minnesota's environment is so much like mine that I'm saying, hey, this is what I need to identify and this is what I need to address. And I've done that with the chevrons, and it seems to be making a difference. I get a lot of positive feedback on it.
Great.
So great point, great comment earlier, and good matchup with the 500 feet. So it may not be your sharpest curves that are the issue. It may be some sweet spot in the middle, but looking at your own data can really help to draw this out. If you don't have details by individual curves, which a lot of folks don't, a lot of states don't have a curve inventory and know the radius of all of their curve locations, you can start to look for binary indicators. So maybe just on a qualitative basis, do your locations have a narrow clear zone or not? Yes or no? Does this location have a passing lane? Yes or no? And you can do that through visual inspection. So either through aerial imagery for some of this, like a passing lane, the presence of a paved shoulder. If you had an intern that could go out and drive all of your roadways and collect videos of those, they could then come back to the office and go back through and maybe check off yes or no whether certain characteristics exist. Maybe you have a video log already and could sit somebody down to do that, especially During the winter months for the northern states, when things slow down a little bit, you might be able to do that.
Just on that comment, I was just clarifying for accuracy, and I went back and checked, and it's 5 counties in Minnesota that did that. So they were looking at the 5 counties on those radiuses, and that's where they came up with the number that 80% of the severe crashes on curves with radiuses between 500 and 15.
Fantastic. All right, well, thank you for that. We should put that in here as a note. So this is looking at it from more of a binary standpoint, but again, on the left, we're looking at the percent of the system with the risk factor. So only 23% of our system has a narrow clear zone, but 38% of the severe lane departures are occurring on sites with narrow clear zone. So that's overrepresented. So that's what we're looking for with these types of graphs is overrepresentation, and that's indicating a clear risk factor. Passing lanes and street lighting are actually slightly underrepresented, so I wouldn't pick those as risk factors because only 20% of our crashes are occurring on sites that are represented across 25% of the system. On the other hand, we see a protective factor here. So 44% of our sites have a paved shoulder, and only 12% of the lane departure crashes are occurring on those locations. So it appears that a paved shoulder is really providing a protective factor for these types of crashes. So we may want to flip this and say we're going to look for sites that have an unpaved shoulder. And we may want to do that as opposed to looking for sites with a narrow shoulder, because even though 88% of our crashes are occurring on locations with a narrow shoulder, 85% of our system has a narrow shoulder, so it's not really giving us a clear risk factor, and it's also not helping us to narrow down our list of sites. So we're only eliminating 10 to 12% of our locations, or 10 to 15% of our sites. We're not really focused in as we would be if we were trying to identify sites with a narrow clear zone. Any questions on interpreting these types of charts? Because you'll be doing this as part of an upcoming exercise.
The question on this one kind of comes back to, and I'm looking at the paved shoulder, and if I'm reading things right, the percent of the system with the risk factor is 44%. So they're saying something like 44% has a paved shoulder, and the percent of severe lane crashes where, so in other words, that's showing that the paved shoulder has some major benefits.
Correct.
Is that most likely because of edge rutting, and it's virtually impossible to keep edge rutting out any extended period of time?
That's a good possibility, and it'd be something maybe to collect as part of your analysis. As this, when you look at the sites with an unpaved shoulder, do many of those locations have a severe edge drop and a rut along the side? So if you did notice that on many of the locations that had an unpaved shoulder, that may be the risk factor as opposed to the actual paved shoulder. But the paved shoulder is helping to push that rutting out further beyond the travel lane. This is just another way to look at it. Maybe you have traffic volume instead. So if you have traffic volume on your road, you could look at traffic volume as a potential risk factor. And this is showing 2 different focus crash types. So a little bit different than the previous ones. The bars on the left are the roadway departure. The bars on the right are the head-on, the cross center line crashes. So there may be different volumes that impact different types of crashes. So it's kind of the higher volume locations that have a higher risk of head-on crashes, where some of your lower volume sites may be a risk factor for just general runoff road crashes. If you had very basic data on only the facility type, you could use that as a risk factor. So rather than focusing on all of your roads, do you want to look at your arterials, your collectors, and are these rural or urban? You could do some graphs of that nature, and in this case, we would say that our rural major collectors are overrepresented. Especially for these curves, they represent just 65% of the curves, but 76% of the fatal and serious injury crashes. So even something as basic as functional class could be used as a risk factor if needed. If you don't have any data or have very limited information, there's almost always some information that you could get your hands on. But if you wanted to look to the published literature, I would start with the NCHRP Report 500 series. There's a whole series of guides. There's over 20 volumes, and each volume relates to a specific crash type. So this volume 5 is for unsignalized intersections. There's a whole volume on tree crashes, or utility poles, or signalized, or whatever the case may be. If you find your focus crash type, if you identify your focus crash type, you can likely find a report that ties directly to those crashes. And when you go in there, it talks about what are the objectives that we're trying to address. And for each objective, say in this case, we're trying to reduce the frequency and severity of intersection conflicts. That's one objective. Under that objective, it has lots of strategies. And for each strategy, in this example, it's provide left turn lanes. It describes the strategy. It describes the cost. It describes some of the potential issues with implementation, whether it's maintenance related, and gives you all kinds of information and details on those strategies. So if you're looking for published literature, I would start with the NCHR P500 series. And eventually, so we've identified all potential risk factors, we've evaluated those to a smaller list, and then from that list of risk factors, we want to select the ones to move forward with to help prioritize our sites. So the risk factors, again, should relate to the potential for crashes, so it should be somewhat data-driven, and they should tie directly to your focus crash types and facility types. There's no set rule for how many risk factors to include. Generally, we include more than one, but basically we want to select enough risk factors to narrow our sites down so that we can focus on an appropriate number of locations. It doesn't do us much good to have, bless you, one or two risk factors and we still have 90% of our sites that we're looking at. If we can add in a couple more risk factors and narrow that list down, that's what we want to try to do. Because eventually you're going to want to apply a countermeasure, and you may be applying for state funding or federal funding to do that, and they're going to want to know why you selected one location over another. So if you had 100 locations and they all gave you the same kind of risk score, and you picked number 99, they're going to want to know why you picked number 99 instead of 56, even though they all have the same score. There's not a good answer for that. So maybe you can do some things like weight the risk factors a little differently, or add another risk factor in, and that can help to tighten up your list of sites. So Thurston County and several counties in Washington have used as many as 6 or 7, and even beyond that. I think Thurston County used 9 risk factors. Is that right, Scott? Yeah, for runoff road. Yeah, and if you have any questions during the break, Scott Davis is in here from Thurston County and has applied this effectively. And there's actually a case study at the end that shows the types of risk factors they were looking at. It may be appropriate to combine risk factors. So as you're browsing through the literature, it may not say that narrow shoulder width or narrow lane width is an issue, but it may say narrow pavement width is an issue, and combined, the narrow lane and the narrow shoulder are increasing the risk. So it may be one, it may be the other, or it may be some combination of risk factors that really elevates it. But that's something that you can also look out for. So again, the key to this is data. So you're going to need data to identify your focus crash types. You're going to need data to identify your focus facility types. And most of that can be done through the crash data. So if you only had access to the crash data, you can get pretty far along in the process. So the crash data is going to give you the crash type, the crash severity, some details about the crash location, even if it's just the officer's coding that, yes, it was curve related or intersection related. That's not always 100% accurate, but it's going to give you a rough idea, especially if you're looking at it from a statewide level or a region level as to what your issues may be. When you're analyzing risk factors, you're going to need more information on the roadway characteristics. There's no easy way around it. It can come in different forms. It doesn't have to be super detailed, getting the radius of every curve, but even just whether a curve is present or not can help. Or if you're looking at corridors, are there 10 curves per mile? Are there 2 curves per mile? That can help, and that can be gathered relatively quickly, especially with very cheap labor. So I highly recommend hiring interns during the summer. So where does this data come from? Certainly, there's some general data sources up here. So the crash data are reported from law enforcement. Sometimes law enforcement houses and maintains that crash data. Other times it's turned over to another agency for housing and maintaining. From the roadway side, maybe you have a GIS department or a planning division that has some roadway data. Maybe it's housed by others, but it's good to look into that and start asking questions within your agency and try to figure out where that information is available. And if it's not, maybe there's an opportunity to collect it. But a lot of times when we start to have discussions within an agency, especially if it's involving different groups, so you get some folks from planning, some from design, some from traffic, and maybe there's a safety person, during those discussions, somebody says, I didn't realize we had that. So maybe you have a sign inventory that maintenance is responsible for that you had no idea existed, but that could really benefit your systemic program because you could quickly identify where your signs are located. So these next few slides are an example, and then we're going to go and do an activity, and the activity mimics this example. So I'm going to walk through the example first. If you have questions, let me know. For this example, the first thing we want to do, we're going to start off with our focus crash type. So 3 things we want to do: identify the focus crash type, 2, identify the focus facility type, and 3, identify potential risk factors. In the next activity, we'll go into assessing those risk factors and looking at the charts a little bit closer. But the first step is pretty straightforward. We want to identify the focus crash and facility type. And in this case, we have a state program, so we're focused on state roads. But then we can take a look at this a little differently and say, well, what if we were focused on the county roads? Would that change our selection at all for the focus crash and facility type? The next step is to identify potential risk factors. So what factors would you evaluate if you had unlimited information? So just start to brainstorm those potential risk factors. And then if your state had a very limited data set, what would be those critical risk factors that you'd want to make sure were included in there? It's maybe a little bit hard to see from the back, so hopefully you can see it on your screen or on your slide deck in front of you a little clearer. But our focus was on state roads. So we have all roads in the state, and then we have a column for state highways. So we're going to focus on the state highways. What would you say might be our focus crash type based on this information? A little bit louder. Run off the road. All right. So we see that 46% of our fatal and serious injury crashes are related to run off the road. This gets into driver behavior issues as well. Aggressive driving, drug and alcohol, seatbelt use. But from the state system, especially from an engineering perspective, maybe we would focus on run-off road crashes as our focus crash type. Beyond that, unbelted seems to be a large percentage, as does drug and alcohol. I think those are actually flipped around. How would this change if we were focused on the county system? So I said statewide may not be the same as your local county. Sorry?
Wow. Yeah, it's a big difference.
Yeah. The unbelted jumps big time for the county roads here. 75% of these crashes are related to unbelted occupants. So that may be a focus, and that very well could be. So now we need to partner with our folks in education and the enforcement and have some targeted campaigns perhaps to address these unbelted. But from an engineering perspective, we may still be focused on run-off-the-road crashes. All right, so we've identified our focus crash type. So from the state system, we were focused on the roadway departure, the runoff road. What facility type do we select now? And this is where we take a look at the crash trees. So we're given a crash tree, and in this situation, we're just trying to follow the numbers to figure out where we can have the greatest impact with these focus crash types. So from a statewide perspective, the first thing we did is break this down by state, county, and city. So we were told that we're going to focus on the state system, but that's also representing the largest percentage of the runoff road crashes. And maybe that has to do with the number of miles as well. But anyway, that's the greatest number or the greatest percentage and where we're focused. So the next split was rural or urban. Are we focused on rural or urban areas? 77% of those state crashes are occurring on the rural systems. Are those intersection or non-intersection related? That may be a little bit of a silly branch here, but at the same time, we can include it to see what happens. But 78%, as we would expect, are non-intersection related. But if you did identify that a large proportion of your runoff road crashes are intersection related, that may get you thinking, and what else is going on there that we might need to address. So beyond that, are these on freeways, multi-lane highways, or two-lane state highways? And they appear to be predominantly on the two-lane roads. So at this point, this is kind of our focus facility type. We're looking at state roads, the rural two-lane roads. And then beyond that, it's just confirming the proportion of crashes by type on those facilities. Oops. So it's showing that 81% of the crashes on these two-lane roads are runoff road. Another 10% are across the center line. So that's just confirming that, yes, we do have a pretty good focus crash type to look at on these two-lane facilities. So I mentioned the crash tool maker. If we have time at the end, I'll demonstrate that. But there is a tool available, and hopefully we can share that with everyone. So risk factors we talked about earlier. You do have some slides to go back and refer to, but thinking about the risk factors for runoff road crashes on rural two-lane roads, what would those be? Curvature, ADT, lane width, shoulder width, and so on. What would be the priority risk factors if you only had, say, 3 data elements in your data set that related to the roadway or traffic characteristics? What would be your 3 priority data elements for this type of analysis?
ADT and radius.
Traffic volume, yep. Radius, or yep, even curved presence maybe. Anything else? Speed? Great. Yeah, so you could think, if we had a limited budget to collect data, which is often the case, maybe think through what would be those priority data elements to collect before you do anything else.